Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second installment of conversations around topics that maybe don't get talked about as much. Robert and I are obviously brave enough to be posting these, or at least we posted the first one. Haven't posted this one just yet in relation to us recording it, but you guys will see. Today, Robert and I were thinking we'd actually like to touch on the topic of identity. I thought it'd be a really interesting topic for us to discuss for a lot of different reasons. One, because I think that it's just a very interesting topic that we spend a lot of time thinking about trying to answer the question, who are we? But I feel that sometimes we go about answering it in the wrong way, and the way that we try and answer it ultimately actually just creates more suffering for ourselves. But I think it's also a really interesting thing for us to look at and examine during the world of COVID, because for many of us, our sense of identity has been taken away because we put our identity in a lot of external factors, like what we did for work or what our social life looked like or how often we traveled, all of those types of things. And even who we are in relation to our friends and family, because we can't interact with them in the way that we are traditionally used to. So I feel like the concept of identity is actually a really topical topic, as well as just a very interesting topic in general. So I wanted to kind of ask you, Robert, what do you think about when we talk about or look at the word even identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I think of identity, the truth is I think of change and like impermanence a little bit. So what I mean by that is, as I know we both have explored who we are and what makes up our identity. And for me, how I define who I am has changed over the course of time. So for me, identity is something that is ever evolving based on our experience, based on the culture, based on, I think a part of it probably is based on like where you are, your environment. So there are certain identities where you might want to, for any number of reasons, keep it to yourself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not something that's working within you and something that guides you in your life. So yeah, identity is definitely complicated because certainly once upon a time, I like to think of those as like you're just locked in, like it's something you're just locked into, like this is what you are, this is what you're not. And you can sort of understand yourself better by figuring out what you are and what you are not. But as I've gotten older, that hasn't quite been the case. So that's why I do agree with you that it can be pretty tricky.
Yeah. Oh, it's true. I feel that we want identity to be clean cut and very one dimensional because it feels safe. And even with what we were talking about last week with intersectionality, it doesn't matter who you are or how you identify in any regard. We're all very complex, multifaceted people. And sometimes in the pursuit of trying to figure out who we are and create identities, we get lost. We sometimes get further from who we are, but also it tends to just really complicate it. And
Yeah.
even with what we were saying last week, you can hold many identities, but that doesn't mean that all of those identities have a place in whatever activity you're doing in that moment. So when you might be a dancer or an artist, but then also be an athlete. Because I do think that a dancer is an athlete, but from my analogy standpoint,
Yep.
you might be an athlete, like a competitive athlete where you play sports on a team. And in that moment, that is your identity because that's the part of you that's coming out. But then you might also be very delicate. And because even with dancing, it takes so much physical stamina, but it's a different type of technique compared to sports in a competitive, like competition game style thing where you're having contact with the other team. Or even an artist, you might be a musician, but then also be an athlete. Even though you are both of those things, you don't necessarily always enact both of those identities at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we can give a lot more power to a certain identity over another, which I feel we talked a little bit about last week too, just even with being queer, both of us are queer. Sometimes it can feel like that has to always be in our resume of our identity, even if it doesn't feel important to us in a certain moment. It almost feels like we're betraying that sense of self because it took us so long to even accept that as part of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very complex. But one of the questions I'd love for you to even answer is, how have you maybe struggled with identity in so many different ways? Because I also think, again, we all struggle with it, but we don't
Yeah.
necessarily talk about it outside of the classics. Like, obviously, people understand that we've questioned our identity because we've questioned our sexuality. And that can seem, it's like a blessing and a curse. It's a
Mm-hmm.
blessing because I think it has forced us to get comfortable with having those conversations around who am I outside of mainstream society. But sometimes I also think that traps us because we think that we've discovered who we are and we can leave it at that, even though,
Oh, right.
because it's the twofold. We
Yeah.
get the gift of, I think, the gift of going through that process when other people might not, but the gift can also come with the burden of being like, now that my whole life is about queerness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so to give a very personal example, I feel like by now I have come out like 4 times. So there's a joke of like you never really stop coming out, meaning like you will throughout your life have to assert who you are, just depending on what is happening in your life
Mm-hmm.
or the situation. But I came out when I was a teenager as gay, and as you also know, my partner is non-binary and transgender. And when we started dating, my partner had not come out as trans or non-binary yet. So for me, given the fact that we're still in a relationship together and we've navigated it, certainly I can tell you like one of the more challenging things is navigating the context and how that's changed between us and still being able to tap into ultimately just our feelings about each other. So it was very complicated, but the reason I bring it up is because, do I think technically that I identify as a gay man now? Uh, I would say no, because it doesn't feel technically correct to me, and it feels like it's erasing my partner. However, I don't know what other label is more appropriate at the moment. So
Mm-hmm.
I always say as a queer person or as a queer man or something like that, because my life is not an experiment. I'm not going to go
Mm-hmm.
around hooking up with a bunch of people like I'm conducting an experiment to figure out whether I'm like bisexual or pansexual or
Mm-hmm.
uh, a lot of those terms that I think have been developed in a rapid succession and has been integrated into culture very quickly. So it's an interesting place because I would say it's the first time in my life where I guess I'm letting that situation go a little bit because it doesn't really affect my life.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I spent a lot of my time strongly identifying as a gay man. I had to fight hard in order to exist publicly as a gay man. And so, like, I could see someone having difficulty in navigating this and being like, there's a sunk cost almost to reevaluating who you are, meaning like all that struggle I spent, as a gay man, it none of that was taken away just because of my relationship now. So it is complicated, but I guess where I am now is I'm a little bit more compassionate towards uncertainty and when people still have to decide certain things about themselves to give them space for that. And we've talked about this before, but in culture and in society, there's not always space to be that way. And and the hardest part about like what I would call over identification would be that you assert such a strong reaction for people who is within your identity, and then those who are outside of that identity. And to me, over identification would be using that as a very black and white way of treating people, which I think can get very, well, I guess what I feel is that it can get very disappointing, because how accurate is that a way to navigate life when everyone's a complicated, nuanced person? Perhaps it'll protect you from some things, but I tend to think there's always a cost of not trying to look at someone as a complete, complicated person. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my general spiel about how I feel about identity and the ever-changing nature of it in some
Thank you for sharing that. I, for so many reasons, one being your story really demonstrates how complicated identity can be, even in situations when you're so sure of your identity before.
ways. Mm-hmm.
And then something happens and you're like, okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
And also thank you, because I think that, in Lana's brain, in my brain, what you just described is also, I think, a really beautiful story and analogy around the complications of really rooting self in an identity for people who maybe aren't in your situation. And like, even an example would be how, as a career, as an example, people decide when they're little like what kind of career they want, and their whole identity is formed around this career. So even when they're like a little kid and someone asks them, what do you want to be when you grow up, and you're like, I want to be a doctor, I wanted to be a lawyer. I still think I'd make a good lawyer.
you would.
I
You
like
would.
I like to debate, and I like to pick apart people's arguments. So I always wanted to be a lawyer. And so when people would ask me, what do you want to be? I'd say, I want to be a lawyer. I said I wanted to go to Harvard Law. I watched a lot of Matlock when I was little. So I had like this whole identity planned out.
Mm,
And let's just say that I went through with it. Like, I'm really happy that I had a realization earlier around the reality of what it would take to be a lawyer. And I'm thankful that I got the reality of that, because I actually one day then spoke to someone who was a lawyer, and they told me what being a lawyer actually was like, the day to day. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want that. But for some people, they spend their whole lives forming a sense of identity around something, only to one day have to question that identity for whatever reason. So it could be you always wanted to be a lawyer, you go to law school, you do all this stuff, and then all of a sudden you realize you're not actually happy, because part of your identity was in the reality that one day when you get to X, you'll be happy because you finally become the thing you want to become, or you become dissatisfied because you don't like the realities of the day to day, or just something in life happens that you've never planned for or never contemplated, and therefore can still be like a rock of your identity. And not to like summarize your experience into like a career experience, but just like I'm trying to, because they're like not the same. Yours is way more complicated with way more stuff. It's just to kind of demonstrate that we don't have to be in an extreme situation like yours, where we're coming so head to head with identity, for us to really understand how complicated rooting our sense of self in any identity, even when it seems so certain,
yeah,
is very unhealthy. I know I've gone through that experience with like my own
yeah,
questionings around,
yeah.
everything, sexuality, gender, all of the things.
All of it, and you're still figuring it out, and that's where I think we really connected. As I was saying, like, how is you being deserving of respect, compassion, and understanding in space and time? What does any of the things you're questioning have to do with that? You know what I mean? I think there's some basic things that we can bring forth to everybody, but yeah, you know, I know someone who is a stand-up comedian and trans, and they have at different points in their life identified as a lesbian, as bisexual, And to be honest, I can't even, like, I don't even know what her sexual orientation is now, as they would define it. But yeah, and they were saying like, but during all those times, I truly was that because I chose it, and it's okay that I changed my mind as I got older. Sometimes we are exploring these things when we're like teenagers, like early high school. It's okay that we give ourselves time to change and also for life to happen and for us to figure things out. Um, and I guess what I mean by over identification is like this is something we all have to answer for ourselves. But how much is our identity rooted in trying to assert control in our lives? And because we know that life is uncertain, and it's a way for us to simplify our life. The truth is, I think identity is always complicated. So when we use these labels to protect ourselves from certain things, it can often, I think, be disappointing when life gets messy anyway. And then we're like, oh, well, this didn't give to me what I thought it would give. So life was complicated when I was a gay man, by the way. It was when I came out and started navigating dating, very quickly, I had to come to grips with the fact that my race is a component in dating. And prior to that, I thought the hardest part of my life was going to be coming out as a gay man. And I had to integrate that and be like, oh, now that I'm here, I identify as this. I did in some ways, I guess, feel that life would be simpler, meaning like I have developed some understanding and rules of engagement in my life. But life is still complicated and messy. And I figured out another dynamic. And when I say like I have to keep coming out, I mean like, we've talked about developing our spiritual life and like being more bold with our spiritual beliefs. That honestly, it felt exactly like coming out of the closet. Like all the worries and the concerns were the same. What would people think? What about the people close to me? It's gonna feel like it came out of nowhere. Like all the same um, inclinations were
Bullshit.
coming. Yeah, all the same fears and inclinations were coming up,
Yeah.
and it had nothing to do with my sexual orientation. So now I'm in a place where I was like, I think I'm just gonna keep coming out over and over again based on how I want to live my life. And that's okay.
It's more than okay. And I think you don't have to be queer to have to come out. Like the idea is we always
Mm-hmm.
have these parts of ourselves that we feel shame or apprehension around because we feel that they're not accepted in either our communities or society as a whole. And so because we have that apprehension, that shame, that guilt, it causes the resistance around us truly just embracing that part of who we are, and to say like letting your freak flag fly.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of us don't want to be freaks, but ultimately we are all fucked up freaks. Is that's my take on myself and all people, and it's beautiful because I think that the idea is
Yeah.
we are that way. And it's, as you were saying, like we become very over identified. So because we feel that shame or that guilt or that resistance, and not having a place or having a level of acceptance, or even just being able to, like, again, with spirituality component, just wanting to have conversations with people and having conversations with people and feeling like there's no space for that, it can also have us, really root down in who we are and almost become angry about it. So because we feel angry, because we feel that we are not accepted as we are, we make others the enemy. And I think we see that in a lot of discourse between all types of communities, whether they be considered in some way like an oppressed community or not, or an othered community. You see a lot of anger and resentment. And I've seen in my own history, like anger and resentment around feeling as though it's not fair that other people don't have to struggle with certain things in the same way
Mm.
I do, which,
Mm.
is where then we root down in the identity. So the identity almost becomes like our badge of honor of saying like, I fought, like
Uh-huh.
I fought this fight and this is kind of who I am. And we've spoken about this like offline, but for me, I know in my own like questioning, I always just say it's like questioning or exploration, curiosity, because it doesn't have to be heavy. It hasn't always been heavy, but sometimes it's very heavy. And then a lot of the time it's in between. So sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's super heavy. Most of the time it's just some in between around my own exploration around gender and self. And it's been like a very roller coaster ride. And it was really driven by this idea that I felt like I had to actually come out the other side with a conclusion. So,
Mm-hmm.
and my three options are like, stay as I am, which is like she, her, woman, trend, go to the other side. So like he, him, guy, or fall in the in-between of gender non-binary, they, them. And what I would do in all these situations, it was just always like, yeah, like this roller coaster of emotion, trying to like pick as if it's a choice, but like trying to sift through these things, because what I did feel like is I felt like I had to make a choice. I had to make a declaration that I am one of these things. Since I have so much uncertainty, that must mean that there needs to be a decision needs to be made, a new identity needs to be formed, or I need to accept the identity I have. And whenever I would go about it in a checkbox way, I would look at like, what does it mean to identify as a woman? What does it mean to be she or her? And I had like this, like society tells us what it means. And I'd be like, okay, like I check some boxes. I don't check all the boxes. Then I go over here to like he, him. And I'm like, I actually check more boxes, I feel, on this side than I do in this side. But like, either option leaves out parts of who I feel like I am. So if I choose this box, I'm still giving up stuff over here. If I stay where I am over here, I'm still giving up stuff over here. And then that's when people would assume, okay, that's where you choose gender non-binary. That's where you choose they, them. But then even in that box or in that situation, that ascribing of that identity still feels like it's asking me to make compromises. And for me, one of the simple compromises is the idea that I'm really, really easygoing and I don't actually care how you identify me, as an example. And I feel like if I take on the identity of they, them, I'm aligning myself with a cause, which I like the gender non-binary cause. And therefore I have to give up things, or I have to like ask people to call me by a certain pronoun, or I feel like I have to like dive into all of this discourse because if you're going to be gender non-binary, you have to do the work of the person that is gender non-binary. This is my own, again, the complications of identity, right?
Yeah.
The stories. So for me, I'm like, okay, I'm spending all this like mental energy and emotional energy, let's be real, trying to like figure this out. And it feels so heavy and it feels so intense, which is also like not necessarily me. Like I really like heavy and intense, but I also like light and fun. And what I kind of came to the realization of intensity in all these situations is in every situation, what was happening was I was going out into the world and trying to determine who I was based on the external world around me. That's where I came up with these check boxes. This is where I came up what it meant to be she, her, a woman. This is where I found out what it was to be a man or he or him. And this is how and where I found out what it meant to be gender non-binary or they, them. All of those situations involved
Yeah.
me in
Wow.
relation to the world. And instead I said, maybe that's causing me all of this problem. So instead of asking who am I in relation to the world around me, maybe my question actually needs to be who am I in the absence of the world around me? And in pondering that question, my like classic true Lana answer is that ultimately I am just a person standing on a spinning rock in the middle of infinite nothingness space. So ultimately, it does not matter what label I pick. And it's like this funny thing where my power actually came in deciding not to pick an identity. And even when the conversations come up and people ask me, like, what are my preferred pronouns? I usually say to them, I will respond to anything. You could call me like it. You could call me like Spider. Like, I don't care what you call me. I like my name, Lana. Lana feels like me. But then in terms of pronouns, I usually say like, I can I call myself she, her, but I often actually find myself not referring to myself as a woman. I refer to myself as a person or a human, and just being like, call me what you want. I'll respond. I don't really care. And at least for the time being, I am done trying to analyze this obsession with identity around gender. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So one thing that is tricky about this area is that often there's a lot of pain.
mm-hmm,
So when I hear you describing like the internal debate that you had, I heard a lot of I heard a lot of um, I heard a lot of pain. I hope
mm-hmm.
it's okay that I said that.
Oh, and of course,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
pain
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah. Like no matter what, there's like a cost kind of
Yeah.
feeling, and I definitely have related to that. You know, if it, specifically around gender, it's an interesting question because I would feel that all those questions, it's like if it doesn't affect your romantic life, who cares? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of these questions also is just being honest. I think it has to do with like, because we're thinking also about like dating and relationships and things like that. So that is a component where gender is a component of that. So I understand the preoccupation, but but ultimately the way that we make connection gets to be decided by us, you know. So I just wanted to like throw that out there in that, you know, we can spin the wheels for as long as we want, but at the end of the day, it's like, how do you want to connect with people?
Mm-hmm.
And if something is occurring that gets in the way of connection, I understand having to go through the hard work of like introspection. But but I guess it depends on like what's your intention around connection or what is unfulfilled in the way you see the world. What is incomplete? Is there anything incomplete? If you don't
Mm-hmm.
need or want for anything as far as like just who am I, then you might have what I would call like not a problem, you know. But I guess
Mm-hmm.
it really it really has to come from like an emotionally honest place. So like as far as like making a decision around your gender, it's like I would follow what pain where pain is taking you and where healing is taking you in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, and maybe take it out of those places where we have to give like the names are supposed to like give you something, but
Mm-hmm.
as coaches certainly we know that we have all these things, we have our stories, but and then it comes down to like making choices. So you know, if it's not a problem, then it's not a problem. But I definitely do feel like people can overcomplicate things or again just use it to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But you just got to be very careful. If you're protecting yourself from life being messy, I think you're going to be disappointed.
Well, because life is immensely messy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Doesn't even matter if you're cis, straight, white, male,
no.
or whatever. Life is, we might have a lot in common because people struggle. So you know, these, you can go on forever about some of these things, but I do think at the end of the day, we're trying to figure out how do I want to show up in the world? How do I want to connect? And how do I live a life of greater visibility and fulfillment?
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely, I mean, how often do people come to you for coaching to with a very specific thing they want to focus on, but it actually is about life itself, like how they view the
Yeah.
world. You know, it just keeps getting bigger. And I think this is an area where that can often happen. It could be about whether you're gender queer or gender fucked, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or it could be like, it could be around like my relationships are so messy and I don't know how to get out. I don't know how to figure
Mm-hmm.
this out. You know, maybe your identity will provide some clarity or maybe not. But it depends on where you feel most emotionally honest in terms of.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that made any sort of sense.
It made sense to me at least, or I think it did. Ultimately, do we ever know if we're truly understanding what someone's saying? I think that's part of what these conversations are about, is sometimes we're not. But
Yeah.
I think what you were saying around the connection piece and identity is really key, because ultimately, and connection is not, you brought it up in relation to like our romantic relationships. And I think for me, what I have explored, like why there is deep pain around my own exploration around gender, is because ultimately, like, the relationship that suffers is my relationship with self. My,
Yeah.
like, you,
Right.
when you're struggling with gender identity, it's very hard to appreciate your body. But then I also understand that, like, people have body dysphoria, like,
Hmm.
who are like, I'm in the right body, and like, I'm a man and I have a man's body, or like the biology, like, of it. So the body dysphoria piece can happen anywhere. I know for me, whenever, like, I like look at my body or think about my body, there's the gender dysphoria in the body, but then part of it is sort of like, but I don't want it to look the other way. So I don't really, you're just sort of like, okay. But it's about, so instead it's actually about an appreciation. And that's something that I've been learning more and more through my own personal development work and spiritual work, is if I actually obsess less over gender, like, like a socially constructed concept in some ways,
Yep. Yep.
and I just recognize that, like, it's just a body. And when I look at it from
Hmm.
the lens of, like, it's just a body, I can actually move to a place of loving it. So this is something that I think we talked about Ali Lou like Lewis last week on our recording. Maybe I maybe brought up something that Ali said, but
Oh, maybe.
um or maybe it was to someone else, but I bring up like someone that Robert and I both know. But I was having a conversation with Ali Lewis last week, and one of the things she said to me that I feel like applies in the situation is, she said, when you're too busy judging someone, you have no room to love them. And we were talking about it in relation to you being in relation with someone else, like whether it be you judging your partner, a friend, a parent, someone who's hurt you in some way. Like, when you're judging them, there's no space to love them. And for me, like, it resonates with me and my relationship to my body. So because I spend so much time judging my body, there's no room for me to love it. And that's why I felt like I was trying to pick an identity, because if I picked an identity, then I could finally love it. But what I came to realize was the pursuit of trying to pick an identity wasn't the issue. If I just accepted the fact that it's just a body, then I can stop judging it and I can move into a place
Mm.
of appreciation and love. And so
Hmm.
looking at it from, I'm just a body standing on a spinning rock in the middle of infinite nothingness, is it's meant to just help me recognize that maybe it doesn't matter, because what actually matters is not, for me personally, for some people, picking the identity is the key to them loving themselves. For me personally, it's the realization that picking the identity doesn't matter. I just need to repair my relationship with my body and how I
Yeah.
perceive it and feel about it. And I think
Yeah.
that can relate to, you don't have to have a gender identity crisis. It can be
Right.
any identity crisis. Like, if you're questioning your career, if you're doing enough, or you're questioning sexuality, it can be, you're just questioning anything. If you're either judging others, but most likely judging yourself, there's no room to love yourself. There's no room for compassion
Yeah.
when you're too busy judging someone else, or yourself. And I think that that's the problem with over identification, is it puts us in a position of judging
Yeah.
versus compassion, as you were saying, which is ultimately the only thing we need, is the compassion piece.
Yeah. Because, I guess I'll say this. Part of the reason why I believe me and my partner's relationship, that we have the relationship we have today, is because they helped heal my relationship with the divine feminine and the sacred masculine. Meaning, once upon a time, I had sort of swung hard in one direction or the other, to be like, basically with a mindset of basically like, this is right, this is wrong, in other words. And part of seeing Eric's journey has been to really, first of all, expose a lot of stories and internalized judgment I still had, and also ultimately to find a way to exist in synchronicity and not think about it in that way. Like, am I being masculine or feminine right now? Or when I do this, like, which is it? You know, it stopped serving a purpose for me, but possibly I would say because of witnessing someone do their own healing journey has helped me heal some parts of myself to be more comfortable and not have to figure out, well, what made me comfortable and what made me uncomfortable. It was almost just like a way of being at the end. And so having that now, it's something that I definitely don't want to lose. But even that, you know, I want to say the success, I think, for many people for looking in is the fact that we stay together, which I don't consider to be like the measure of success. If we had stayed together, but we actually were not meant to stay together, it would have hurt them and it would hurt me as well. So this is really about like owning yourself and respecting yourself at the end. And we both had to go through a lot to figure that out. So that's why I'm very proud of that, and I bring it up. You know, we both do. But it goes back to what you're saying. It's like the struggle has to be worth. The struggle is, I think, is only worth it if it can go towards more personal fulfillment, personal connection, and diving into who we really are. If it doesn't feel right, then that probably, you know, will not happen. But I just wanted to bring that forward as, you know, you never know what life's going to throw at you. At least that's how I feel. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But yeah, it does go back to like just decency. Like, what's the decent thing to do for yourself, and what's a decent thing for you in your relationships, and going from there, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think not to dive into something forever about. So I'll say the point and then we can wrap it up and we can expand on this episode or whatever we are calling these, another conversation. I have my podcast brain on is like the pursuit, like you were even saying with you and Aaron in your relationship, is that ultimately it's this level of fulfillment and completeness as two selves who then enter into this loving space. And that's why you're able to not still have the ups and downs and the questionings and the wonderings of identity, but that's how you're not over identifying or feeling like, oh, I have to give up my title as a gay man that really caused me a lot of pain and suffering. But ultimately, all of that pain and suffering brought you to who you are right now, and who you are right now is a person that's in a loving and connectful relationship with a wonderful human being. Right. And ultimately, that's the thing we strive for more than the title. And I think that, again, your relationship is this perfect analogy around how sometimes the title or the identity that we associate with something, we give it too much power, and it takes us away from the thing that we actually want, which is just meaning and fulfillment and purpose and love and connection. And sometimes we need to ask ourselves, is us identifying as something, whether that be like man, woman, queer, gay, straight, whether it be like lawyer, yoga teacher, coach, whatever it is, whether it be like religious, non-religious, like the idea is we all in our life will go through so many cycles of letting go of an identity, bringing in an identity, sometimes thinking we're over something and bringing it back, realizing we've spent a lot of time ruminating over something that doesn't matter. Like that's part of the messiness you're speaking about. Like life's messy. And our desire to sometimes have these clear-cut labels leads us off our path of fulfillment and purpose. And I know for myself, that's definitely something that I'm working through. So I just wanted to say thank you too for reflecting that, because I think your relationship is this perfect example of how if we just give up the need to identify as something and recognize that ultimately what we're actually seeking is the connection, as you said, we'll be on the right path. So the title doesn't matter. The identity doesn't matter. The thing that we're actually seeking is the connection. And sometimes it's just asking ourselves, is the desire to label something or identifying something, is it enhancing our sense of connection or is it taking away? and just being really
Yeah.
conscious and aware of when it is and when it isn't, because there's no right
Yep.
or wrong answer, and it could look totally different for two different people. So I just want to say,
Oh,
like, that
yeah.
was a beautiful point you made.
Well, thank you. I know we have to wrap up, but
Yeah.
yeah, it totally. If I were like in the midst of like dating currently or something, I would have a different conversation about all of this because
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a different situation. But given that, I'm in this relationship that I'm in, I made the decision that it really doesn't affect my life one way or another.
No.
So yeah, at different moments, we would definitely make different decisions. For me, it would be on the basis of finding connection and
Mm-hmm.
authenticity and things like that. So yeah, the reason why I no longer the reason why those identities in the moment I when my partner came out was I navigated the way I did was because if I didn't do that and I had, let's say, overly identified as a gay man, it's like some part of me knew that I was like, man, if I don't sit still and figure this out like until we've arrived at an answer
Mm-hmm.
together, I would regret this for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Like at that point, identifying as a gay man in this sense, I just had this feeling that number one, this is a very important moment in my life. And number two, it was like, you always said, don't live without any regrets. So you better be fucking sure.
Yeah.
So there was a moment where I knew, like, had I been like, but I'm a gay man. So that's that. And also, like, me being a gay man, when my partner came out, it's not like my love for them just like shut off like a faucet.
Yeah.
So as it turned out, things didn't work in a black and white way. And I had to own that and be like, okay, things are a little more complicated. We have to figure out what's up. So
Mm-hmm.
in that moment, had I stuck with like, I'm a gay man, so I don't date trans people. If you are someone who identifies as both gay man and you don't date trans people, which there are some folks like that,
Mm-hmm.
then for me, I think I would have looked back and a part of me just would have wondered, like, what if, you
Mm-hmm.
know, the decision wasn't based on my emotions or my feelings or a relationship, it was based on a label. And I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
have that. So hopefully, I don't know if that's helpful to anyone out there, but if you're having doubts over all this, come talk to me. I'm not,
Yeah, Robert's great at it.
yeah, I'm all definitely it took a while, and that's probably why I feel so closely connected to you, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But I was like, I get the messiness. That's
Mm-hmm.
way more valuable than clean cut.
It is. It, and I think it's just more valuable because clean cut just doesn't exist. Life's too complicated. And if you embrace the idea that it is messy, it actually is what leads you to have more compassion for yourself. When we expect it to be clean cut and clean, just clean, we have a lot of shame and guilt when it's not. And that in and of itself is the whole issue with whenever we feel like, going back to even how the conversation started, when we feel like our identity doesn't fit into what is socially acceptable, either as a society as a whole or communities, it doesn't feel clean. So we have shame or guilt or resistance around it. And if we instead just embrace the reality that we're all, again, what did I say? Like, we're all fucked up freaks or something like that. And things are,
Mhm.
and the world's messy. It just allows us to have more compassion for ourselves. And we have more compassion for ourselves, we are able to have more compassion for others.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Robert, again. We're going to be doing this again next week. So we'll see what topic comes up next week. And if anyone
Oh.
watching, if you have any suggestions too, always feel free to let us know. And again, as a disclaimer, like, no part of Robert or I think that our opinions are truth. They're just our truths.
Yeah.
And there are many realities, and us having these conversations is not meant to preach or to make people feel that they have to agree with us. It's just more meant to have a dialogue and see where that dialogue goes. And our conversation hopefully sparks conversations that you can have either with us, with yourself, or with others. But keep being awesome, and we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.